What is the best gaming CPU? Well, if you're wondering and you've come to this video, then today I am going to answer that question for you, where we have the 7800X3D from AMD, which is currently the best-selling CPU almost worldwide. At least when I check the Amazon sales and I ask retailers locally here in Australia about their sales, they all tell me the same thing, and that is the 7800X3D is the best-selling CPU. Except when I look at Japan, it's number 2 there. Though we also have the i9-14900K, which is Intel's fastest and also power-hungry CPU, and I actually came into an unstable problem with this CPU in today's video, and we'll get onto that later. And then, of course, last up, we've got the Ryzen 9 7950X3D, which was released before the 7800X3D, commanded a higher price, and only 8 of the 16 cores carry that 3D cache, which is so important for getting that extra FPS. But how much extra FPS do you get? Let's find out in today's video, where we're going to do a side-by-side comparison, test at 1080p, low settings, and also 1440p ultra settings with an RTX 4090 right after today's video sponsor. If you want to get rid of this annoying activate Windows message, then today's video sponsor SCD Keys has you covered for as little as $15 US after you enter that coupon code BFTYC. You can cop yourself a legit single end user license today. Also works for Windows 11 Pro too. Links in description below. Welcome back to Tech Yes City, and let's get this comparison started, where the first title that we've got up here today is Manor Lords, a newly released title, RTS, and we're testing this at first 1080p low settings, where the 7800X3D actually gets the edge on these really low settings, and then it's followed by the 14900K and then the 7950X3D. However, they're all really close in comparison in terms of their FPS. I can't think off the top of my head if there's a 700 Hertz monitor currently available, but if you've got one of those, I think it's 480 or 540 Hertz monitors, then you're going to be absolutely fine with one of these three CPUs, though stepping things up to 1440p Ultra, and here is where we get a difference of virtually nothing, but the 7950X3D does start to beat out the 14900K ever so slightly at this higher resolution. Though onto CS2 now, Counter-Strike 2. Here is where the Ryzen CPUs did score a sizable victory over the 14900K to the tune of roughly 100 FPS. Now, the 7950X3D did slightly edge out the 7800X3D, and that's because it's just got slightly higher clock speeds when you're utilizing those 8 cores with the 3D cache. And I guess if everything else is running perfectly fine, then you will see a slight victory go to the Ryzen 9 over the Ryzen 7 counterpart. But this ultimately does depend on the game and, of course, the resolution and the settings you're using. But let's move up to 1440p Ultra here, and here is where the differences are actually very mitigated, and the GPU now starts to get stressed. Even in CS2 at 1440p Ultra, the 4090 starts to get stressed close to 100%. Now onto Helldivers 2, and for this game I don't have a PSN account, and I'm able to, in Australia, log into the game still, but I think in 170 countries in the world, this game is currently requiring you to log in with a PSN account, which is pretty dumb of Sony to do this. But let's look at the FPS here anyhow, where we've got 1080p low settings. Here's where the 14900K scores a victory over both the 7800X3D and the 7950X3D, and stepping things up to 1440p did see a similar trend here. Though onto Fortnite, here's where the biggest curveball gets thrown in today's video, and that is the 7800X3D did better than the 7950X3D in Fortnite, but also the Intel CPU out of the box settings, it just didn't boot up properly. The game would not launch, and so we've recently made a video on Intel instability issues. I'll put the link up here for you guys if you want to check that out. I actually came into this when I was trying to launch Fortnite, and it would just keep crashing. So I mean, I can go into the BIOS, of course, and tune it, but for the sake of today's comparison, I do like testing out of the box settings because I'm recommending these CPUs to people who are looking for the best gaming CPU, and when the game doesn't even launch, that's a big L for Intel going into this comparison so far. Though the last title to pull up for you guys is Baldur's Gate 3, where I run it through this very strenuous scene. This is the most strenuous scene I could find in the game, and I've done 3 playthroughs through Baldur's Gate 3. Absolutely love this game. And what we got here, 1080p lowest settings, is the 7800X3D gets over 300 FPS, same with the 7950X3D, but the Ryzen 7 edges out the Ryzen 9 in this particular title. And then the 14900K comes in third place. And then moving up to 1440p with the Vulkan engine, the differences are minimized, just like the previous video we did on the Ryzen 5 versus the i5. And this, of course, is an awesome thing to see when the games are really optimized and you can get the most out of your CPU, because that means the cheaper stuff can also be utilized to a better extent. Though speaking of that better extent, here's where we're going to pull up the power consumption numbers. And all throughout this comparison, you've probably been looking at the power numbers whilst we've been testing these games. And you'll see here the Intel is definitely dragging along, trying to compete in terms of FPS versus the AMD counterparts, but it does so at the cost of efficiency. And it does this with a huge difference between especially the 7800X3D, where in CS2, when we just ran the raw power numbers whilst we were gaming, you were getting higher FPS on the Ryzen CPUs, but you're also getting much lower power consumption from the wall for this same FPS. Now for the Intel CPU, you can go into the BIOS and spend a bit of time tuning down the power consumption numbers, but that will reduce the FPS actually quite significantly if you do this, but it will improve the efficiency quite a bit. I have done a separate video on this. I'll put the link up here. However, doing stuff like this, it's definitely not for everyone, especially the average guy who's just going to get a CPU, drop it in their PC as either an upgrade or build a new PC. They don't even know what going into the BIOS is a lot of the times, and so they want the CPU to run out of the box as best as it can. And so with Intel and also AMD, I would just love to see these companies release, as soon as you boot up the PC for the first time, have the option there. What do you want to do? Do you want high efficiency? Do you want highest power? Don't care about power consumption? Or do you want a balance mode? And I think if they had automatic settings for that, as soon as the person booted up the PC for their first time, they could lock that in. That would really give them a better option to get the most out of the CPU the way they want it. Though, speaking of going into the BIOS and changing settings, this isn't just limited to Intel. I actually, for today's video, had to go into the BIOS and change one setting on the 7950X3D. And this was the prefer cache setting on the CPU cores, because without setting this on in Windows and Counter-Strike 2, the first game I booted up, I noticed the FPS was a lot lower than the 7800X3D. And straight away it was performing very similar to that of, say, a 7950X, but even doing so at a lower clock speed. And so doing this, setting this in the BIOS, just makes it so that it uses the 8 of 16 cores with the cache on board, the 3D cache, and it prefers to use those cores, giving you higher FPS. Because if you don't put this on, then basically you can either set affinity manually on the games, and that's turn off the CPU threads for that particular game, or of course you can just deal with the FPS being lower and the CPU cores struggling to juggle themselves around to get the best FPS. Though all this now leads to the justification of the Ryzen 7 7800X3D being the best selling CPU. Because as we've explained with the Ryzen 9 7950X3D and the Intel 14900K, with the 7800X3D, we don't have to go into the BIOS and change preferred cache settings, or don't have to mess around with any CPU core affinity or change any power limits. This CPU just simply runs really well out of the box, and it does so at coming in at pretty much half the price of these other two higher end variants, but it does so with giving you the best gaming performance, or at least trading blows depending on the title, in these titles that we tested here today. So if you want the best gaming performance and you don't want to break the bank, and you also want something that's going to be very easy to use, then the Ryzen 7 7800X3D is going to be that choice for an obvious reason. Though the final point to mention here though is the 7800X3D does have 8 cores, 16 threads, and that's half of the 7950X3D, and it's also less than, I think, the 14900K has 24 cores, a lot of those being E-cores, 16 of those being their E-cores. I call them Cinebench cores because if we show you the Cinebench results right here, we can see that you do get a lot less max theoretical performance with the 7800X3D. So I guess that's the only catch. If you are wanting to do professional work and you just need a lot of performance out of your CPU, then obviously you're probably not going to be looking at the 7800X3D anyhow. But that being said, it does perform quite well in the single core performance, and the multi-core performance is nothing to poke a stick at, especially since if you're video editing, nowadays a lot of video editing software will utilize your GPU cores a lot more than they ever did. so you'll actually get away with this CPU as a great workstation CPU too. As for the temperatures, whilst we were gaming, all three CPUs were absolutely fine. However, when we're in Cinebench, they were pushing around mid 80s, and in the case of the i9-14900K, was going to just under 90 degrees. And this is with one of the best air coolers currently available, the Arctic 420. And so with everything said and done, I think it's a pretty clear-cut choice. If you guys are in the market for the highest end gaming CPU right now, you're also going to get one of the best value CPUs too, and that is the Ryzen 7 7800X3D. But speaking of that value, this is in the higher realm. And so I recently just got done testing the Ryzen 5 7500F, and if we look at, say, pull up a game like Helldivers 2, if we go to lower settings at 1080p, I noticed that the Ryzen 5 7500F actually wasn't that far off the 7800X3D or the 7950X3D or the 14900K. And this was with the 4070 Super. So depending on the game you play and the monitor you use, you can definitely save a lot of money going with the Ryzen 5 options and the mid-range graphics cards, and especially if you're playing competitive titles, and that money saved you can put towards your next upgrade in the future. So just because it's a 7800X3D and it's currently the best gaming CPU out there at the moment, doesn't mean that it's the best option for everyone. I guess I put it down to two categories. There's going to be the first group of people who just want the best gaming performance possible, but then there's going to be the second group of people, and they just want to go out and buy a 7800X3D because they want to make their penis bigger. And if that's the case, guys, like, go ahead. I mean, that kind of stuff, I hear it costs thousands of dollars, so you can get away with just buying the 7800X3D and get an enlargement, then that is going to be a great thing for $300 or so. And so there you have it. With the 7800X3D, it's definitely going to service both those two groups of people. And with that aside, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's comparison. If you did, then be sure to hit that like button. Also, let us know in the comments section below, what do you think of this comparison here today? Which CPU are you rocking in your main rig and why? Love reading those thoughts and opinions, just like this question of the day here. And this comes from Burfoot Topknot, and they ask, can I ask what power supply tester is being used in the video? So they're talking about our recent video used parts hunt, where I was testing out a heap of used power supplies, and I just used a simple power supply tester that I got years ago off AliExpress. But I think since then, I got this for like $10 at the time, maybe like $7 USD. I think since then they've gone up to maybe $20 or something, but they're very useful if you are dealing with a lot of PCs, especially used PCs. This thing is invaluable. It can save a lot of hardware. It can definitely not just double down as testing power supplies, but also testing cables too, which is something that I use it for when I'm using different modular power supplies, which we've actually got a video coming up very soon talking about this because it was a hot topic in the recent parts hunt. Anyhow, hope that answers that question, and I'll catch you guys in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.